Welcome, welcome, Jascha
Hi,
Rohr.
Thomas.
If I had to sum you up in one sentence, I would call you a therapy for society, a therapist for society.
Oh, that's nice.
And
Thank you.
I give you time to elaborate on what that actually means. Just let me quickly give a framing for what we're talking about today, which is steering adaptation, the function of moving society, global society, humanity, 7.5 billion people towards a good future. And we will ignore what we call future actualization, which is the description of a good future for this conversation today. And we will also ignore what it takes on a personal level, which we call deep alignment, to be strong enough to navigate whatever comes. But focus on the mechanics of how to steer adaptation towards a good future. And the reason why we're doing this is because you have not only extensive experience in helping groups and larger portions of society move towards a positive future, but also you have a lot of knowledge about this. And I'd like to have that conversation today about in the focus of sharing your knowledge to help other people make more sense of their steering activities. So with that, I'd like to hand over to you to share something about you, your background, and then we can dive into steering adaptation.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot for being in your podcast, Thomas. And well, I think your introduction was already quite descriptive and very charming. So I wonder what might be important or interesting for you or the listeners to this podcast to tell about me and my work.
So I would say that you have built some organizations that help people.
Yeah. So.
And I think this could also be a good starting point to explain your thinking behind moving.
Yeah. Okay. Well, actually, I think I start with the permaculture academy. That was sort of the first organization I built. I learned about permaculture when I lived in London as a student, and the permaculture diploma and permaculture design there. And when I came back to Germany, I found that the sort of German permaculture scene at that time, there was an association, but there was no functioning education. And my interest was really to help people getting the skills and the knowledge to actually design sustainable environments in the broadest sense at that time. That was my main focus. Like, how can we actually design sustainability as human beings in our societies and in our groups? And so I always thought that my main contribution could be in actually providing the frameworks and the organizations for people to help developing their skills and knowledge around this. So in that time, I also participated in the first co-working space here in Berlin, and had a couple of other small projects and institutions. And then later on, I founded with my partner the Institute for Participatory Design, because we kind of found out that as long as you work in sort of this green bubble, you will not reach wider society, and you will not be able to really get leverage on societal transformation as a whole. So we said that we can take the approaches of designing in a participatory way for sustainability and transformation, but put it in an organizational form that would allow us to move deeper sort of into mainstream society. And we did that with the Institute for Participatory Design. And
I just want to use your maybe Freudian mistake that you just made, the participatory and the perma. And build on that, because you started with perma culture, and that is inherently something that has to do with farming, with nature, and not so much directly with society. So what are the ingredients you're taking from permaculture into moving into a participatory design of society?
Yeah, I always feel there's maybe a little bit of misconception about permaculture, because permaculture has two aspects of it. And for me, as I understand the founders of permaculture, it's always been a design methodology, an approach of how we as human beings can design our environments in a way that is sustainable. Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, the founders, called it permanent, because at that point in history, the term sustainable didn't exist. So they were looking for something else, and they said it. We need to create a sort of permanent society or permanent systems. They were pretty much systems based in their thinking. I mean, it was the 80s, sort of the mid 80s. And they used this design approach in a certain and specific field, which was growing food, agriculture, and sort of providing for the nutrition of societies. That was sort of the focus on which they first developed their methods of design. But they themselves found out pretty soon that the design principles they developed and they derived from observing nature could also be applied to other societal systems as well, for the economy, or for how to design for communities and communal life, for example, even to industry. So nowadays, if people talk about permaculture, they often focus on the gardening and agricultural aspects, and that is a very important part of applied permaculture design. But the methodology of permaculture design itself is pretty sort of universal. And I and my partner Sonia, with whom I then founded the Institute for Participatory Design, we always believed that the greatest value of permaculture lies in this design approach, in teaching us how to observe nature and how to derive from these observations guiding design principles for designing, creating, planning in society.
Okay.
And so from that understanding, the step going towards participatory design wasn't that far, because we're still saying our main focus is on design. We want to understand how people can design their environments. There's a clear focus on this has to be done in a way that the results are transformative towards sustainability. And we believe that the way how we come to a design, there's this very nice word in German, it's Entwurf. I like that much better than design. So the way to get to an Entwurf is through participation.
So just for the German, the English-speaking listeners, could you quickly describe what Entwurf could mean in English and why you like it better than design?
Yeah. So design, as I understand English, I mean, I'm not a native speaker, so maybe I'm getting this wrong as well. But design for me is the result as well as the process. You call it design. You design something, and in the end, the result is a design of something. And in the German language, yeah, a design can be a result, but there's also this word which is called Entwurf, and it comes from throwing, to throw something, sort of on a paper. For example, you throw your ideas through your pencil on a paper, and that is your Entwurf. And it's describes much more the creative process, the flow of how ideas emerge and get concrete in a model, in a prototype, on a piece of paper. And that is a nice notion, because I feel that this process is at the basis of how we as individuals and as collective groups come to our solutions, is through this process of designing.
So the direct, and just had a look. The direct English translation for Entwurf is draft.
A draft, yeah, that's right. Actually,
I'm not sure a draft captures the dynamic part of the German word for that, because as you say, you're throwing your idea onto paper, so it's much more dynamic than a draft. But yeah, that's the image.
Yeah. I mean, in German, you can, for example, create phrases like die Welt entwerfen, so to draft the world. This is not really possible in English, from my understanding, like using these terms. But in the German language, it means the whole process from having a vision or even a sort of vague idea of a normative future society, over through generating ideas and concepts, and then sort of making them concrete through drawing or building or writing and so on. And this whole process is Entwurf.
So this is what you're focusing on, using the design patterns, knowledge, process of PERMA, and apply it to societies through through participatory design. What does that look like?
Well, actually, I believe that there are a lot of sort of design methodologies, from design thinking to landscape design to permaculture design and so on. And usually these design processes are done by experts. They're trained for designing in their specific field. And we say, rather than letting, for example, citizens in a public participation process just deliberate on their ideas to generate opinions, we are interested in empowering citizens to actually go through the same design processes as experts would in the same case. So we are actually empowering them to use the same tools and the same methods. So we ask them to do observations, we ask them to do analysis, to do interviews, to draft, to make models, to write, to interact in various ways in the same kind of processes experts would do. So if we, for example, facilitate urban development project, then we would look how an urban developer or an agency for urban development would work, and we would sort of do the same steps with the participants. So we are really enabling them to read the maps, to read the sort of background information, to get out there, to do all the analysis, which is important as a sort of foundation for a good design or draft. Then we would show them how to design for themselves, how to do that actually, how to create ideas and work on these ideas and put them down on paper or in a model, etc. And since we are doing this in large groups of many people with very different backgrounds, education, and opinions, what's happening is that this not only becomes a process of a small group who is already aligned, but we have to create this alignment in this collective groups of very different individual people as well during the process. So it's always two parts. It's facilitating a group process with a certain dynamic and all the politics and issues and dynamics you have in diverse groups. And on the other hand side is empowering them to undergo this almost professional design process. And these two processes are fed sort of in a stream together through the work we do. And the result, hopefully, is, if everything turns out the way we hope to, is that the groups align themselves during their process towards goals, what they want to achieve in future, and also come up with very concrete emergent solutions how to achieve this future.
And you say large groups. Well, how large is such a group usually?
Well, usually, sort of in public participation, groups tend to vary from, I would say, 30, 40 to 120, but we've also worked with groups up to 500 people.
And how long is that process? And does it always the same, or does it scale with the group size? Because I imagine that it becomes more difficult with group size.
Well, I like longer processes, but basically the time of a process is not dependent on the amount of people participating, but on the time frame we get from whoever sort of hired us to do this work. For example, a public administration, they have a project, they have a deadline, and that actually sets sort of the time we have. And of course, the financial and human resources we can sort of employ to facilitate this project. So it is rather the other way around, that we sort of have framework conditions, sort of money, people, time, the task at hand, the question, the design challenge we want to solve, the people who are invited. And with all these frame conditions, we will have to come up with the process design. So this is always part of our work, is we don't use sort of a standard process, but part of our work is always that we take the framework conditions and make a custom-made sort of design, a custom-made process for these framework conditions, so that we feel we can be successful in the given framework.
Okay, so you've done that with all sorts of groups and in all sorts of contexts around shaping elements of civil society. Now the task at hand, if I put it bluntly, is to do that with 7.5 billion people. We somehow
numbers growing rapidly.
Sorry?
The numbers growing rapidly.
The numbers growing rapidly. So let's say 8 billion people. So moving 8 billion people through such a process towards a good future. Let's say we solve the to-do list the UN gave us in form of the SDGs. If you could dream up a way of doing this kind of process with 8 billion people, what would that look like?
Mhm. I don't know for sure, because again, it depends on the framework conditions. So, but maybe let's start with the 8 billion people. Of course, no one will be able to engage 8 billion people fully in a process. Well, maybe it is possible, but I wonder if it's necessary. Like if we design for a public participation process or urban planning process in a city, even if that city has, let's say, 800,000 inhabitants, our event, our participation process will include maybe 200 citizens from that city. So it's always this question.
Is that a ratio that you
No, I just made it up.
Okay.
No, it's not a ratio. But what I'm trying to say is that the people with whom you work in a participatory process are, of course, often much smaller than the people, sort of the group who is affected by the results. And there's a whole science towards how to choose the right people. And it's all about representation and legitimization of these processes. Those are the questions you have to ask yourself: is how do I represent all the groups I want to be represented in my process? And how will the process legitimize the results later on, so that people can say this was a valid process and this is a valid result. And even if I was not involved, I trust the result of this process because of the way how the participants, for example, were chosen or invited. So that is just one technical aspect of it. But of course, the question is, if we come to climate change or plastic in the ocean or the coronavirus or whatever you want, like how could a truly participatory co-creative process look like, who tackles global issues on the scale? And for this, again, I would apply the same approach. I would ask, okay, what is the subject? Like, is it climate change or is it the coronavirus? And it would be completely different frame conditions for designing a process. And maybe if you're asking for a concrete idea, the best example is to speak about climate change, because this is where we as humanity have the, I would say, most advanced participatory or solution finding process through the climate conferences, the COP climate conferences, and the IPCC scientific research, which is published regularly. So if you now say, is this sufficient? I would say no. This is not sufficient at all for tackling this. And now we would start designing a process. And this is a creative process I haven't done yet. I would love to do it. We have started here and there. And the question always is like, do you want to start introducing, for example, more and more frequently participatory elements in the already ongoing process of the climate conferences? Or would you rather say, this doesn't make sense at all, it's a failed approach, we'll have to set up something completely new? So that would be the first decision we have to agree upon. And then we can start building up.
Okay, so, but what I'm hearing is you're guided by the constraints. So climate, for example, because that's one of the more pressing issues, but they're all interconnected. And so if we use the existing model of segmenting all of the challenges, the SDGs,
Mhm.
describing how we want to solve the SDGs,
Mhm.
and activating people into doing that.
Yeah.
And you saying that we need to identify the people that are the most important stakeholders to represent the target group. So
Mhm.
you just as a you just gave a random number, a city, and then you have a couple of people in the participatory process. How would you go about? Let's pick one SDG. We can have climate action for that. How would you go about if there were no conferences to identify the people that should take part in that process? How would that work? Given that, and let's move one constraint out of the way. Let's say the UN gives you basically unlimited budget to do that. And the
Yeah,
time
actually,
frame, sorry?
Jeff Bezos just announced
Yeah.
his 10 billion climate fund.
So Jeff Bezos or World Economic Forum or the UN or somebody gives you a billion or two to do this.
Mhm.
And of course, you have to be really fast as possible, but also
Mhm.
as thorough as possible. So time is
Yeah.
only a constraint, not because of the project owner,
Mhm.
but because of the necessity of the
Yeah.
situation and the
Yeah.
urgency. So choosing without a monetary constraint, without time constraint, choosing the right people from 8 billion people, how would you go about that?
Yeah. Well, let's start thinking about this. I haven't done this, so this is
Okay.
sort of on the sketch design now.
Yeah, let's do it.
Um, first, first thing I always think about is, do we have a structure who can support and hold this whole process?
Mm-hmm.
That would be my first sort of focus.
Mm-hmm.
So if this is a global process, I would say we definitely need sort of local action,
Mm-hmm.
and we need structures and communication support to synchronize this local action globally.
Mm-hmm.
So given your frame condition that I have unlimited resources, one of the really important things, and we already spoke in another conversation about that, would be to have some kind of collaborative, co-creative online platform tool, maybe even sort of based on blockchain technology, which can support local processes and is able to combine and synchronize solutions, ideas, and open questions on a global level, so that everyone who wants to participate in this process can have easy access to questions, challenges, solutions, tools, methods, and can share their own result easily,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even with some intelligent algorithms which match solutions for certain conditions, for example, which
Mm-hmm.
are similar. Because I strongly believe that there will never be one climate solution for everyone, but that we have to have a manifold local solutions. So this would be one thing I would start setting up right away, getting sort of a structure which can connect. Then I would probably start by providing a couple of formats for participatory interaction, which can be easily multiplied and sort of learned by local process facilitators,
Mm-hmm.
so that they get a sort of almost like a playbook or something, to help them setting up co-creative participatory climate action locally. And your question would then come as a next step, like, whom would I involve? I think for something like climate action, I would make it completely open. I would say, like, everyone should be involved who wants to contribute. So it's more like a self-invitation process. And we know this, for example, from formats like hackathons, where you also get a sort of framework, you get questions, you get a sort of websites and tools, and then local groups can self-appoint, for example, workshops or labs or formats where they come together and collaborate on finding solutions for what they seem to be the most pressing issues. And I think with these three building blocks, like having a global open source platform to share and co-create, having a methodological framework and sort of a playbook, how to use formats and how to train local facilitators in facilitating and guiding these processes, and giving conditions for local activists to actually self-organize themselves. I think that are three steps I would suggest. And then the fourth sort of design element would be to build some strong, if you want, APIs towards formal politics. So that in some way or the other, national governments and international governmental organizations will somehow have to take up the solutions which are worked upon by these groups, by these activist groups. They somehow have to engage with them, and they have to feed them in their legislation process, because we will not be able to just do sort of have activist action alone will not save the climate, but activist action on a local level and national and international legislation supporting this action, both together probably will, or has a good chance of changing something.
Okay, so couple of questions. The first, I would argue that that there is some sort of a tool that can be used already out there that is at least good enough for what you want to achieve.
Tell me.
Well, I can't pick one from the top of my mind, but I am sure somebody has built a collaborative tool that solves most of your questions that you would have for such a tool. So
maybe it's also just a combination of already existing tools.
Maybe, yeah. There are some tools that are on blockchain that are targeted at group collaboration. So let's assume that this is out of the way, because that's probably the easiest part of it. And let's also assume that the other technological components, which is bubbling up pieces of the conversation and matching and mixing locally between all of these conversations in an automated fashion through some sort of machine learning, is also doable, but it's probably a bit harder than the first part. So what I'm struggling with is if the tools and thirdly, the formats are also exist. So they are teachable. We can use video. We can use all sorts of methods to help people facilitate these types of formats. So the basic building blocks are in place, and you don't need massive funding to do all of that. The hard portion of this would be to activate the people. Yeah. So even activating, let's say, 10 people per country, which isn't a lot of people. So you would need to activate 2,000 people around the globe, roughly. How would that be done? That's
to
the hard
activate
part.
the people.
Yes. How would you get 10
that's
people
always the hard part.
Yeah.
I believe it wouldn't be that difficult to get 10 people. The problem is rather those 10 people might be already involved in a couple of other processes. I mean, there are more than 10 people in every country in the world who care about climate change and would like to contribute something. And they have a lot of processes and offers from which they can choose from. So the question is, why should they choose yours? And I strongly believe that people tend to move towards those offers or those programs which have there's this word in German, I just try to translate it. It's Wirkung. It's agency, basically.
Yeah.
So where they believe they can contribute the most, where they have the greatest agency.
Or
so
effect.
So that what they actually do has the kind of has a real impact, and their input is valued. And this, of course, is one of the main problems with participation. So people come towards a participation event, they give all their ideas and their time and their resources to it, and then it's just ignored by administration or politics, for example.
That's the second part. So you say you think it's doable to activate 10 people per country into this?
Yeah, I mean, look at it, the SDGs. I mean, this is the classical incentive model by trickling down a lot of money. So you have the SDGs, and you say you have a program, and NGOs can apply for the funds if they have some great idea of how to contribute to the SDGs. And what we're seeing for the last couple of years since the SDGs have been published is like a huge amount, an amazing amount of activity of NGOs worldwide to contribute something to the SDGs through the funding they get. What I always wonder is that there is no broader alignment. There is no general culture or normative future those are all working towards. I mean, they try to reach these goals on a local level, on a national level, on an international level, and there are thousands of programs, but no one is kind of synchronizing, aligning, bringing sort of adding it up to one big action, or maybe a few big actions, but sort of, you know.
Do you think it's
so
necessary?
I would say people are there. If the resources are there, you'll get enough people to participate.
So when I asked myself that question of do you need a shared common objective that we work towards, something like, what does the world look like once we've solved the SDGs, essentially, right? Because we will change it by solving them. And then we could also work towards that future, which might be a lot more inspiring to
Yeah.
people than solving a bunch of issues. But when I have conversations with people around this really difficult topic of describing the future, I am unsure about whether there should be a concerted effort of describing that future, and then creating one big shared future, or whether this is an already ongoing emergent process.
It is.
Because when I look at the people who are trying to live in the future at the moment, they're all of them are roughly doing the same thing. Little variations, but more or less very similar.
Yeah. Yeah, please don't understand me in the way that I'm sort of asking for a totalitarian narrative or approach. That's not what how I want to be understood. Yeah. Of course, it has to be a sort of dynamic, emerging process and generative process of many solutions, always sort of in constant sort of evaluation through maybe practicing it and failing with it and so on and so on. But on the other hand side, I believe, like, look at the SDGs, for example, like how did they actually, how were they designed? And I don't know how you think about them. I think that only 2 or 3, the last 3, I think, goals are really sort of eco-based. The rest is human-based, and it's quite sort of also economic-based. And if you speak, for example, to Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker, he would say, like, if we manage to reach all the goals of the first SDGs, the Earth will be dead. Yeah. So, how did they come about? It was a negotiation process, an international negotiation process. So it was a bargaining about interests, which led to the SDGs, how we have them. And now people are trying to reach them, which on the one hand side, I support very strongly. On the other hand side, I would feel like as long as these are sort of compromises on interests negotiated by national institutions, we still might have a problem in reaching them. So I really wonder, like, how could we design a process where we try to reach the goals while also altering and defining these goals anew as we progress. And doing that in a way which leaves enough room for local solutions and adaptations, but also for global alignment in the process without reaching sort of one single totalitarian narrative.
And do you think that this could be a possible outcome of a conversation between 2,000 people on the globe? Because I think that's roughly also the number of people that were involved in the conversations around forming the SDGs, or before that the Millennium Goals.
I mean,
go ahead.
We're working now with Mehr Demokratie. It's a German organization who promotes new forms of governance and democracy on citizen assembly on climate change, a national citizen assembly on climate change, which is sort of citizens assembly. In my point of view, are a deliberative format of participation, not so strongly co-creative, but we're already trying to build in more co-creative elements. And we at the moment think about reaching 3 goals, which is a common vision of a future, sort of a normative idea of where we are going. That's one, to reach that agreement in the group of the participants of this citizen assembly. Then a strategy of how to get there, and a lot of sort of solutions adding to the strategy. So recommendations for the government how to get to the strategy. And I feel we always have, it's like juggling, we always have to have all of these 3 aspects in the air simultaneously. We always have to focus on sort of our normative vision and trying to create a group process where we can deliberate on what we think our future should be like in a fluid, open process. We also have to understand that it needs a kind of strategy or a pathway towards these futures, and that we have to design and craft the strategy. And we should be aware that the strategy wouldn't work if we haven't sort of measures, very concrete single measures we have to employ and test and prototype. And we have to work on all these levels. And you often get these these discussions like, let's start somewhere and don't think about the vision. And then others say, we have to have this huge vision and everything else comes. But I believe we have to work on all these levels simultaneously. And that's make it so difficult.
So probably this is all not new. I mean, the problems that we're dealing with are new, and the scale might be new. Is there some historical precedents that we can use to learn from and to build upon in guiding through this process? Is there historical precedents for humanity coming together and describing a normative future that they then want to create?
Well, there are examples of humanity having success on a global level through means which, compared to the problems they were facing and the time in history they were in, were sound and reached a conclusion, or they reached their goal. For example, the ozone layer is pretty much out of the news. It's still there, but it's getting smaller and smaller. We've banned the chemicals and so on and so on. There are other examples in, for example, getting rid of measles or other diseases worldwide. Now you might question the processes and how this was done, but you could say this is a global effort and it worked out. It did. For the complexity of the questions we're facing today, I believe there's no precedent, because these solutions or the processes where we have already found solutions on a global level have been very sort of simple in terms of complexity. They could be reached by well-known forms of political negotiation on an international political level. And what we're facing now is completely different, because it touches the way how we live. Like we can't just change the climate by banning some kind of products, but we have to change our whole lifestyle.
Okay.
We can't just get rid of plastic in the oceans, but just by banning plastic, because plastic is so enmeshed in our everyday lives and products and lifestyles that we would have to change our whole lifestyles.
So I hear this a lot, that the issues we're dealing with are extremely complex, and that probably they never have been more complex in history of humanity, at least not on a global level, on such interconnected and an extremely dangerous level. which asks for solutions of learning how to navigate complexity.
Yeah.
This is something we're not learning. This is something that is not, or maybe it is, natural to us. How do you work with this? How do you help people to navigate complexity?
I feel that it needs a process of also personal development, and this only can happen through experience. So my solution so far, I know it's a slow solution, but that's what I came up with so far, is creating enough processes where people can make the experience how it is to tackle complex questions while being in a group with divergent interests and backgrounds. Having this experience, seeing how you can work through complexity of a given issue, and seeing that group work can lead to success, that you can grow through it personally and as a group. And through having this experience again and again and again, I believe that that's the way how we learn to understand and use these processes for ourselves then as well.
I would argue that we, as one complex type of complex systems that we learn how to deal with as a human, which is our social environment. Extremely complex, and yet we are somehow able to navigate that. Do you think it's possible to use this type of learning and help people to abstract it in a way that they can start applying it to other complex systems?
Yeah, I think you just gave the answer, but the second step has to happen. So as long as we're just sort of navigating randomly and unconsciously through this complex social world we live in, we will not have this effect. But in the moment you make this conscious, you help people to reflect on it and to consciously make decisions about it, then I think you're getting there.
Okay.
And this is probably the task we have to do. Like if I speak about design, it is all about this making our actions consciously. Because nowadays we're living in the Anthropocene, so that we as a human community on this globe are the strongest earth-altering factor. But it's done unconsciously. It's just the result of our collective lifestyles, how we alter the earth. Now, the moment we turn that around and say, we start to consciously reflect upon and act upon our understanding of how our lifestyle affects the earth. And if we want a different earth, a better earth, a more sustainable earth, we then sort of reverse engineer towards the sort of lifestyle decisions we would then have to make. Then it becomes a conscious action of design.
And usually this type of activity where you make something more conscious comes with a conflict, because once an option to the way you do things right now becomes conscious to you, and you're faced with the question, if I go there, what do I gain and what do I lose by going there? And this creates a certain inertia in people that
Yeah.
stops them from moving there.
Yeah.
How do
Especially
you,
if you have to move alone.
especially if you have to move alone, but maybe even in groups. But how do you resolve this? Because this must be an issue that's recurrent in your work.
Yeah, it is, and it's again one of complexity. And
Mm.
as I said, I strongly believe that if you ask someone on an individual level to make sound and appropriate measures in their life to change or to give a positive example towards climate change,
Mm.
I feel that most people are overwhelmed by these expectations.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be good to have a group doing that. That's
Mm-hmm.
helpful. Even more helpful is if the governments we have create the framework conditions in which it will be more easy to choose these lifestyle options than choosing those harming the environment or the climate.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, again, it's again a juggling issue. I feel that's always the case talking about complexity. We have to do both and. So we have to start doing individual changes in our lifestyle. We have to find appropriate groups who can help and support these actions.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to change the policies on national and international level, because
Okay.
without that,
You mentioned that part several times, and now I give in. Let's move into how do we influence or what is the lever on getting into policy change or I don't even like to use that word, but into real action that is, as you say, legitimated by the people. Um, so, in other words, let's assume we've successfully gathered 2,000 people. Let's assume they had a great conversation. Things have bubbled up. Now we know what we want to do. How do we do it? What's the next step?
well, first I would say they not only have conversations,
Mm-hmm.
but hopefully they have co-created already measures,
Mm-hmm.
products,
Mm-hmm.
ideas, systems, solutions, which they now have to implement. So it's basically, in this case, I'm a social or environmental entrepreneur. I think once you've come up with a prototype, if you know what you want to do, if you have to design the solution, you have to implement it, put it into practice,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of loop and cycle a few times around until you understand if it really works or not.
Mm-hmm.
And how to do that can take different paths. For example, one classical way in political participation would be we write all this down as recommendations, and hopefully we have open and cooperative governments who are happy that their citizens um, have put this effort into finding good solutions, pick it up and put it into policies. I mean, that's just the hope, and sometimes it doesn't work. For example, the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland on same-sex marriage has exactly produced this kind of process.
But that was top down. So that was asked for by the government, and then the government listened.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but in order
So,
for
but
that to
that's
work,
only one way.
that's one way. But in order for that to work, you need to bring in roughly 200 governments around the world first, and then the 10 people.
Yeah.
And if you say that this is the better way, the more likely way, then we should explore that. But if you say the other way is more likely,
the
then
other way is the Gallic village way, which means that sort of we try to find ways to implement the solutions without the government, which in many cases is totally possible in a legal way. Like if you, for example, sketch up a way how to employ a CO2 neutral mobility in Germany, for example, you don't necessarily need the government for that. You could also make alliances between NGOs, car manufacturers, and local public transportation companies, and create a sort of 10-year program alliance to do that. I mean, nothing of this is easy, but I'm just trying to make the point that, for example, we coached a village over a series of 6 years, who knew they would lose their own council, they would lose their sort of their own budgets because they became part of a bigger sort of municipality. So what we did, we built them for this village structures so that they could manage themselves and their affairs sort of in a second system, through having citizen companies who made money, and this money would go into a sort of a village budget, and then they had a sort of decision-making process on how to spend these funds on their own projects, for example, for the kindergarten or something like that. And they could do all this without interfering at all in the classical administrative and political structures of their municipality.
Okay, so you're saying, I'm picking up on that example again. We have the 10 people per country, and they have co-created concrete activity that could be implemented. And now the question is, do we hand this over to a government or do we build it? And the decision is to build it, because in many, many legal frameworks, we can actually implement at least a version or an MVP of that activity, of that solution. Let's say this happens. How much of that activity is needed in order to reach a tipping point where the rest of the societies create enough pressure on the policymakers in one way or the other, or on the economy in one way or the other, to move towards that example that has been built? How would that work? How many pioneers do we need?
I don't know.
Well,
it depends on the solution.
There are some theories around. There's a certain percentage of a population that you need in order to reach a tipping point. I've heard somebody say a concrete number on about how many people are needed globally in order to reach a tipping point. Do you have some hunch based on your experience?
No,
what they could be?
No idea. I know that these numbers are around, but I never know where they come from. If there's sort of estimates, or if there's actually some empirical research behind it, or if they're theoretical, I have no idea. I mean, of course, there are examples like just last year I had a lot of contact to people from sort of meta-modernity networks, and they would suggest that it's always a sort of elite group which kind of creates new cultures around certain, for example, lifestyle habits, and that they are so influential, even they might not have money or power, because they are creating culture, and that this culture is at the core of large-scale systemic behavioral change in societies. Which
why is that so?
Well, because sort of um, the cultural the culture, how it describes how we do things,
Mm,
how we interact as a society, as
mm,
individuals in a society,
mm,
what our values are, what our um, incentive systems are, our
mm,
internal. So am I cool if I drive the big SUV, or am I cool if I have a sort of permaculture herb spiral in my garden?
mm,
So that's a cultural effect,
mm, mm,
basically. And yeah, they would suggest that if you have this group of people defining culture and setting standards and examples of how to live a good life in our nowadays societies and worlds, that this might be more influential than actually having power in the national parliament.
mhm. You mean like creating an iPhone
Yeah,
10 years ago, 12 years ago?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah, for
and
example.
now billions of people are using these types of devices. Um,
Yeah,
mhm.
yeah.
Okay. So something that's is desirable to people
Hmm.
to be part of for some reason.
Yeah, desirable, and which becomes internalized.
Mm,
So this is where sort of maybe being unconscious about things is also a good thing in everyday life, because patterns of behavior become internalized. You just do them
mm.
without
But that's
thinking.
the second step, right? The
Yeah,
first step
yeah,
is for it to be desirable, so you actually want to internalize it because you internalize it because you practice it.
yeah.
But is desirability part of perma design? Designing for
That's a
desirability?
it's a difficult. It's a good point. Don't know. It's a good idea. Maybe it's a little bit like nudging. So
Mm,
which choices do you make available? Which choices are sort of the default of a
mm.
society? Yeah.
Yeah, and the defaults at the moment are probably driven by economic standards. The the bigger, the more I can show using some symbols like cars and such, and how successful I am on an economic level. The more successful am I on the in the meeting game and other social games that we play.
Yeah.
So um, probably designing and adding that to the design spectrum of permaculture to be able to systematically use desirability in order to propel those early experiments into something integrated into the culture of society um, could be worth a path.
Hmm. Yeah. I would agree.
Beautiful.
Hmm.
We touched upon two other topics, but these neither of them are part of this conversation. So I'd like to have them in some other conversation. Which one part was you said it starts with the individual. The individual has to be grounded, clear. Um, that's what I call deep alignment, and I would love to have a conversation about the tools and psychotechnologies that you know of and use yourself to move towards that. And
Hmm.
to share some ways of how do you ground yourself. And the other thing is describing a future. I would love to hear the future according to Jascha. Um, so how do you see it? But again, that's part of future
My,
actualization.
my
Um,
my future,
your
the
future,
vision I have.
the way you want the world to be. But let's have that in a separate conversation
Yeah,
because I believe that this is going beyond the scope of this conversation.
it is.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
I have learned a lot. about moving societies towards something. I'm inspired to act. Is there something that we missed? Is there something you want to add to the conversation?
Oh, there's probably so much. I feel like we could go on like every week, and we always would find new issues and new aspects,
Yeah,
which is exciting. It becomes more the more you talk about it.
Yeah.
Because there's so much to develop, and I think this is sort of the attitude I would like to approach all these conversations. Is like, I feel we also say that in our co-creation foundation. I feel like we're on the verge of developing a new cultural technique I call co-creation, as with reading and writing or agriculture. And now we're at the point where we as humanity have to develop it. And it's a development process. We don't know it yet. We're developing it while we speak, and it's adding up aspects and details as we speak. And that's pretty exciting, I think.
So where do we follow this process? Where do we know what you learn next and how you incorporate it? Do you run a website, a blog, something like this?
Yes, please. We're in the process of founding this co-creation foundation. So we have a website. It's www.cocreation-foundation.org. And we have a first project. It's called the Global Resonance Project, where we say, we don't know yet how this could work, how sort of co-creative governance could work on a global level, but we feel it has to be developed. And we're starting sort of into first conversation and co-creative sort of processes with people like you, for example, and others, to find out just what are the questions we have to ask. Not even trying to find solutions yet. But we're sort of prototyping solutions in our projects. As I said, for example, the Citizens Assembly on climate change on a national level, or the Stadtwerkstatt in Berlin, for example. But here, with the Co-Creation Foundation, we're trying to ask questions first. And please, there's a video channel on YouTube on the Global Resonance Project.
Yeah. So we can add them to the comments on this later, so people can follow. Okay, thank you so much for your time, Jascha.
Thank you, Thomas.
And for all the work you're doing. We need that.
And for your work as well. Thanks a lot.
And I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, definitely.